Every school kid learns the same thing about the Roman legions. They were disciplined, they were trained, they were the best organized military force the ancient world had ever seen. They conquered an empire, so they must have been invincible, right? Except they weren't. The Romans lost battles constantly, they lost entire armies, they lost wars, and yet somehow we remember them as if they never lost at all. And in my view, the real story of the Roman legions is not about invincibility, it's about something much more interesting. How a military machine that was genuinely exceptional at most things systematically failed at specific things, and how those failures shaped history just as much as their victories did. Today, I want to take apart the myth of the invincible Roman legion and look at what their legions actually were, what they were good at, what they were terrible at, and why that matters. The image most people have of a Roman legion is actually pretty accurate as far as it goes. A legion was roughly 5,000 men, organized into 10 cohorts with rigid discipline, standardized equipment, and years of training. They drilled constantly, they marched in formation, they followed orders without question. A centurion, an officer, could have a soldier beaten to death for insubordination. That level of discipline was almost unheard of in the ancient world. And it worked when Roman legions fought barbarian tribes with no formal organization, no standardized weapons, no coordinated tactics. The Romans won again and again and again. This is where the myth of invincibility comes from. Any barbarian warband facing a Roman legion in open battle would likely lose. The Romans had superior training, superior discipline, superior organization. The problem was that not every conflict happened in open battle. To understand the Roman army, you have to understand that it was not one monolithic thing. A legion was the heavy infantry, but the Roman army also included cavalry, auxiliary troops, archers, sea engineers, and logistical personnel. A legion marched with engineers who could build fortifications in a day. It marched with supply lines that stretched for hundreds of miles. It marched with a bureaucracy that tracked everything. This was revolutionary. Most ancient empires just moved through the landscape. The Romans built infrastructure as they went. They would arrive at a location, build a fortified camp, establish supply lines back to their base, and then operate from a position of strength. This is why Roman armies could operate so far from Rome. They weren't living off the land like most armies. They were moving their own supply system with them. In my view, this logistical sophistication is actually more important than the legendary discipline. The discipline made the soldiers effective, the logistic made the army effective. A single soldier with the best training in the world is useless if he's starving. A legion with adequate supplies can fight even if the soldiers aren't perfectly trained. Rome prioritized logistics. Let me give you some concrete examples of why the Roman army had the reputation it did. The Gallic Wars, for example, from 58 to 50 BC. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, modern-day France, in roughly 8 years. He fought maybe a dozen major battles and countless skirmishes. His opponent was Vercingetorix, a Gallic chieftain who was actually a genuinely capable military commander. Vercingetorix understood that he couldn't beat Caesar in open battle, so he avoided open battles. He cut Caesar's supply lines. He fought defensively from fortified positions. It nearly worked. But Caesar's logistical system was so sophisticated that even when his supply lines were disrupted, he could rebuild them faster than Vercingetorix could disrupt them again, and eventually Vercingetorix was forced into a siege at Alesia, where Caesar's superior number and logistics won. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian, later Augustus, fought Mark Antony for control of Rome. Antony had a larger navy, but Octavian had better trained sailors and better maintained ships. The battle was decided not by numbers, but by superior training and organization. The conquest of Britain, for example, from the year 43 and onwards. The Romans invaded Britain and subdued it, despite resistance from British chieftains who had been raiding Roman Gaul. Over and over, the pattern was the same. Rome's superior organization, training, and logistics gave them an advantage, and most of the time, that advantage was enough. But then there was Teutoburg forest. In 9 AD, a Roman governor named Publius Quinctilius Varus was moving 3 legions, roughly 15,000 men, through the German forests. A German chieftain named Arminius, who had been allied with Rome and understood Roman tactics, decided to attack. The legions were spread out along a narrow forest path. They couldn't form their usual battle formations. They couldn't see the Germans coming until the Germans were on top of them. Over 3 days of fighting, Arminius and his warriors destroyed all 3 legions. Roughly 15,000 Romans died. It was one of the worst defeats Rome ever suffered. And here's what's important. Arminius didn't beat the Romans by having better soldiers. He beat them by understanding the Romans' weakness, their reliance on formation, on open ground, on organization, by forcing the Romans to fight in a way that negated those advantages. He neutralized their superiority. Another example is the conquest of Spain. Rome conquered the Iberian Peninsula, but it took nearly 200 years. Small Spanish tribes in mountain regions fought guerrilla campaigns against Roman legions. The legions would come, win, set peace battles, move on. The Spaniards would retreat into the mountains, avoid pitched battles, and stayed ambushes on Roman supply lines. It was frustrating for Rome because the legions couldn't force a decisive engagement, and when you can't force a decisive engagement, superior training and discipline matter less. Eventually, Rome did conquer Spain, but through grinding, methodical campaigns, not through invincibility. In my view, the Roman army had 2 fundamental weaknesses. First, they needed supply lines. This made them vulnerable to enemies who could disrupt supply. Hannibal understood this in the Second Punic War. He couldn't beat Roman legions in open battle, so he maneuvered in such a way as to stretch and disrupt the supply lines while threatening the allies in Italy. It took Rome a decade to finally bring him to a decisive battle, and even then, Rome won only because they had the resources to sustain the war longer than Carthage did. Second, they needed open ground and organization. Enemies who could force the Romans to fight without formation, in forests, in mountains, in chaotic environments, could reduce Rome's advantages. This is why Rome struggled in Germany. Germany was forests and marshes, not ideal terrain for heavily armored legions in formation. This is why Rome never fully conquered Ireland. It was too wild, too unorganized, too difficult for legions to operate in. The legions were extraordinary at what they were designed for: organized large-scale warfare against organized enemies on relatively open ground. They were much less extraordinary at fighting in terror that negated the advantages, at fighting against enemies who refused to give them open battle. As Rome got older, the legions actually got weaker in some ways, even as they stayed sophisticated. By the 3rd century, the legions had been fighting on multiple fronts for so long that recruitment became a problem. They started recruiting more and more barbarians into the auxiliary forces. These barbarians learned Roman tactics and eventually started commanding Roman troops. By the 4th century, many Roman legions were commanded by Germanic or other non-Italian generals, fighting with tactics learned from their own people, integrated into Roman structure. This wasn't necessarily bad. In many ways, it made the army more flexible, but it also diluted what made the legions distinctively Roman. The other problem was economic. Maintaining legions is expensive. You need soldiers, you need training, you need equipment, you need supply lines, you need fortifications. As Rome got larger and more complex, as the borders got longer, as the enemies got more numerous, the cost of maintaining the legion, as they had been maintained, became unsustainable. So Rome started cutting corners. Soldiers didn't train as much, equipment wasn't replaced as regularly, supply lines weren't maintained as well. The legions of the 4th and 5th century were still called legions, but they weren't the same machine that had conquered Gaul or subdued the Mediterranean. So what's the real answer? Were the Roman legions invincible? No, they were exceptional in specific circumstances and mediocre or even vulnerable in others. They were invincible against other organized armies of similar or smaller size on reasonably open ground with decent supply lines. They were vulnerable to enemies who understood their weaknesses and exploited them. They were vulnerable in terrain that negated their advantages. They were vulnerable to enemies who could disrupt their supply. And over time, as Rome's resources got stretched thinner, as the barbarian tribes got more sophisticated, as the structure of the legions themselves changed, even those advantages eroded. The real genius of Rome wasn't that it had an invincible army, it was that it had an army that was good enough and a logistical and political system sophisticated enough to sustain warfare on multiple fronts for centuries. Rome didn't win because its soldiers were better. Rome won because its system was better. And when that system broke down, Rome broke down with it. In my view, this is actually a more interesting story than invincibility because it explains both Rome's success and Rome's eventual decline. If the Roman legions weren't invincible, what made them so effective for so long? Was it training, discipline, logistics, or was it simply that Rome's enemies were divided and Rome's government was unified? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Roman legions were not invincible. They were better organized than most of their enemies. They were better trained. They had better logistics, but they had weaknesses. And enemies who understood those weaknesses could exploit them. What made Rome dominant was not that its army was perfect. It was that its system was so comprehensive enough and its resources were sufficient enough to fight on multiple fronts for centuries, while its enemies couldn't do the same. That system eventually broke under its own weight, and when it did, the legions, for all their training and discipline, couldn't hold it together. The myth of the invincible Roman legion makes for a good story, the real story of a sophisticated military machine with real strengths and real weaknesses, operated by a complex political system under constant strain, is more interesting and more true, at least in my view.